of the American Story of Freedom Seekers. I'm Randall Miller, and I'm a member of the HASP Social Science Committee. And we are very fortunate and delighted this morning to have Dr. Carolyn Carter join us. Dr. Carter is recently moved to Raleigh, North Carolina to take the position of Vice President for Institutional Advancement and Marketing and Communication at St. Augustine College, St. Augustine University, excuse me. And Dr. Carter has a great passion for historical research and genealogy, and she's an experienced underground researcher and historian and has a master's degree in history. I knew her from her days in Detroit when I worked full-time at Wayne County Community College District with her, and she was involved in many different organizations, historical organizations in the Detroit area. So without further ado, please let me introduce Dr. Carolyn Carter. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so very, very much. I'm really excited about this opportunity to talk with you. I try to make it fun and engaging. It's exciting history, it's an exciting time, and I think it's information that we all probably heard of but didn't really know. And it's going to be interesting as I go through the presentation. I just wanted to, first off, thank Hope College, thank Dr. Miller, thank Susan for this opportunity to participate and to share this history, because it's storytelling. It's not just reading a PowerPoint or telling you about something that happened. These are real events that happen with real people that connect us all in some shape, form, or fashion. So, as I tell these stories, people who were involved in the Underground Railroad movement, there were so many people, white, Black, all cultures. A lot of them were Quakers, a lot of them were Methodists, and they had the means and the resources to defy the laws so that they could help freedom seekers. That's the new, not new, but to you, maybe some of you probably knew, buzzword. We don't call them slaves anymore. We call them freedom seekers, because that's what they were doing. They were seeking freedom. They were looking for a better life. And so you'll hear me use that word throughout. You'll also hear me switch back and forth during the presentation as I put on my genealogical hat. As a professional genealogist, I try to attack my research from a genealogical perspective. And that means learning the stories and the history of these people who were so important to all of our history. And so you'll kind of hear some bits and pieces as I tell those stories and how I dove into the lives of these people who made such significant contributions to the American story of the Underground Railroad. So with that, I am going to share my screen and we're going to get started. Can everyone see my screen?
No, we don't have the full screen yet.
Want to go to from beginning again, because we're seeing your
Oh, you're saying, okay, let's go back from the beginning. Share it again.
Okay, now go to click on that from beginning so it only shows the first slide.
You don't see it yet?
Well, I see the slide, but I also see the sidebar ones.
Now what do you see?
The blue circle was like spinning.
Okay, let's go back, share it again.
Okay, same. So you're there, but just click on.
Do you see it now?
Well, I'm still seeing the main slide, but then the sidebar with all the upcoming slides. So you need it to go. You either got to click from beginning or from current. Either one probably will work.
Okay, let me go back from beginning.
Click broadcast slideshow.
Mhm. No, I don't want to broadcast it. And we just had it there. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. It was just there. You see it now?
It needs to go full screen.
I'm going to minimize this. Now, do you see it?
Oh, we see you.
Now, do you see it?
There you go.
Okay. I'm sorry, I apologize. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, this is the story of the Underground Railroad movement above ground network, the Michigan Central Railroad, which was a railroad that was established in the early 1830s. So what was the Underground Railroad movement? A lot of people are unclear about what that was and how it shaped the American slavery system as people traveled this network, trying to seek freedom. So the American Underground Railroad system, and I call it that because that's what it was. It wasn't just the Michigan or the North or the South. There were many, many states, operatives, and people who were involved in this network. That's why it was called the network, because it was underground, it was secretive. There were many routes, of course, through Canada. A lot of freedom seekers left Texas and went to Mexico and the Caribbean and went back and forth. And even people in Detroit and up and down the Detroit River, they sometimes went back and forth, depending on if they were trying to free someone, depending on if they thought they were safer in a different location. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Of course, historians estimate that over 100,000 people escaped that network. Many people escaped alone. It was very dangerous for them to escape with a lot of people. But we know Harriet Tubman, of course, was known as our most famous Underground Railroad conductor. And Harriet Tubman did not come to Detroit. Frederick Douglass did, she did not. Her route was Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Maryland, Virginia, from the South, but she never, ever came to Detroit. Of course, Levi Coffin, who traipsed through Michigan, he was one of the most well-known Grand Station masters of the Underground Railroad, as well as William Steele, and we'll talk about William Steele later. If you saw the movie Harriet, when Harriet Tubman ended up in Philadelphia, she stopped at the home of William Steele, the great abolitionist. William Steele was a slave, and he was, when he escaped, he hid his memoirs in the cemetery until after the Civil War. And then he wrote his book. William Steele's book is available online for free. If you just Google William Steele, the Underground Railroad, you can download his book and you can read about his stories and all of the people that he assisted in the Underground Railroad movement. He chronicles those people. And so those who may be searching for people who may have a connection to the Underground Railroad, or if you've heard stories in your family of people saying that my ancestor was involved in the Underground Railroad, a lot of those names are in William Steele's book. Many of the abolitionists who were involved in the Underground Railroad were also involved in the Masonic Order. And it is chronicled by William Lambert, another famous Detroit Underground Railroad conductor, who was also a Mason. They used those practices in Masonry to select their secret conductors. So whatever those secret rituals that they use for the Mason order, they use some of those same practices so that they could select those secret conductors. And of course, hideouts considered people's basements, their cellars, in different compartments where they hid freedom seekers until they can get them to slavery. Again, slaves arrived from Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, as far south as Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas. And because of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, of course, it made it more difficult for slaves to escape because these laws allowed slave catchers to come back and get their property. And there are many cases, and I'll talk a little bit about that, specifically with the Crosswhite case and the Thornton, Lucy and Thornton Blackburn case that some of you may know or may know about, that was famous for their escape after they came to Detroit, their escape via the Underground Railroad. So let's talk about some of the myths of the Underground Railroad, okay? As we know, many of the workers were not just Black, they were abolitionists, Quakers, and Methodists. Some of the first stops along the Underground Railroad were in the South because people were coming north and escaping. Detroit also had slaves until it was, until after the war, and it was abolished. Many enslaved African Americans depended on each other to help. When a person escaped in the Underground Railroad, they usually escaped on a Sunday. If they were escaping from the South, they would escape when many of the plantation owners were in church on Sundays. Many of the plantation owners kept tight reins on their slaves. There is a book, it's called the Oklahoma Slave Narratives. This book was written, it was a Freedom Writers Project that was written in 1932. And a lot of people who had escaped the Underground Railroad and slaves who had moved from the South to Oklahoma, the federal government interviewed those people and they talk about their escape. They talk about their stories. Each story is about 150 stories. Some of them are maybe 2 pages long. You can look it up online. It's called the WPA Slave Narratives. And they talk about some of the freedom seekers and some of the slaves that escaped the South and what they did and how they did it. So it's a very interesting read, and you can look at that. You can get that. It's free online. Again, the WPA Oklahoma Slave Narratives. You can buy the book free on, not free, you can buy the book on Amazon as well. Slaves made quilts and they used different codes to communicate. A lantern in the window was also a common sign. There are some stories about the lanterns and the quilts, and follow the drinking gourd, the story, the book about the quilts, hidden in plain sight. And as you are studying history, you need to understand that that book was written well after slavery and the Underground Railroad movement. And so when you are researching the Underground Railroad movement or just learning about it, look at the dates and the context, open the book and see when the book was published. If that book was published in 1932, maybe they did not have as much information about those lanterns than what we think. Because think about it, there were no telephones, there was no internet, there was no way for them to contact people. So if my farm was 5 miles from yours and I'm escaping along this route, how would I let the next house know to put a lantern out to look for me when I'm coming? So we have to think about that. And when we are learning about this Underground Railroad history and any history, we're putting our lives in the context of history. And we're learning about history as we go. So as you continue to learn about this, or if you have a curiosity and you want to learn about that, just understand that a lot of things were written that weren't necessarily contextually true. And so we have to be cognizant that me as a researcher, I'm always looking at dates and when something happened so that I can put it in the correct context. So as I was researching, I learned a lot about Holland, Michigan, and how it played an integral part in the Underground Railroad movement. So before I get into Detroit, I just wanted to just mention this history and just think about it. This was along the river, and there was also connection to Canada. So people as far as Holland were also seeking freedom and crossing into Canada via the Underground Railroad movement during this time in the 1800s. So these are some of the historical markers that are in Detroit. If you've been to downtown Detroit, of course, Second Baptist was the oldest church in Detroit that freedom seekers were a part of. They were members there. They established that church. They used that church as an Underground Railroad site. People traveled through Second Baptist Church on the way to freedom to Canada. Of course, John Brown, everyone knows about John Brown and what he did with Harper's Ferry. John Brown came to Detroit and he met at the home of William Webb with George de Baptiste, and there's William Lambert, the Mason. He met at his house because he was soliciting. He wanted money for Harper's Ferry, and they gave him money. Frederick Douglass was also at that meeting on March 12, 1859, where they met at his home to talk about how they can aid him in the Underground Railroad movement. When John Brown came to Detroit, he traveled the Michigan Central Railroad, and there were several people with him. There was one woman in particular that I am told, she was pregnant, and she decided that she would not put her child down until that child reached freedom. So he started with 12 and he ended 13. And she finally put that child down on the ground when she made it into Canada, because she wanted her child to be stepping on free soil. George de Baptiste, of course, he was a Detroit resident, and we'll hear more about him and his brother later. George de Baptiste was an abolitionist. He worked for, he was a personal valet for President William Henry Harrison, but when he died, of course, he lost his job, and he decided, and he came to Detroit. George de Baptiste was an abolitionist, and he was a boat captain. But because he was a Black man, he could not captain his own boat. It was called the T. Whitney. So he hired a white man to be the captain of his boat. And he took freedom seekers back and forth to Detroit and Canada. William Lambert also was a Mason, a member of Second Baptist Church, and a abolitionist. He had a skill. He was he made clothing. Him and former Governor Zachariah Chandler were also good friends. William Lambert used those masonry rituals when they were weeding out those conductors. He was in his 70s when he died. They found him hung in his barn. The officials said that it was suicide, but the family said that it was not. It was, he was murdered. So that's the family story. So the Michigan Central Railroad, of course, was established in 1837, and it ran between Detroit, Michigan, and St. Joe. And then it changed its name. It was first Michigan Central Railroad, then it changed its name along the way. And then in 1838, the depot was built on the where Campus Martius is in downtown Detroit. So if you've been downtown Detroit and you look at Campus Martius, that was the first site of the Michigan Central Railroad. And then there was a fire and it burned. And it moved to 4th Street and 3rd. What you're looking at is an image of the Detroit River from the early, this is about 1860. You're looking towards downtown. You'll see the river on my right, probably your left. And this is the yard of the Michigan Central Railroad, the yard. That dome document, that dome image It's called a roundhouse. And you'll hear me reference that later on when I talk about a specific freedom seeker. But this is what the yard of the Michigan Central Railroad looked like during that time. And right now, this is kind of what it looks like on the river. Here's Wayne County Community College up on the upper left. So all of that area right there would have been where the Michigan Central Railroad sat. The yard ended right at 4th and 3rd Street, right where 4th Street Presbyterian Church is, and Wayne County Community College District office in downtown campus. That was the ending. That's where the railroad stopped. So these are some historical figures that were involved in the Underground Railroad movement. Let's talk about John Murray Forbes. Everyone's familiar with the Forbes family and their fortune, and that was his family as well. But he was an abolitionist, and he was very involved in the Underground Railroad movement. He hired African Americans to be on his trains, and he knew that they were transporting freedom seekers back and forth across the river. He died in 1898, but he was very involved in that movement. He started his abolitionist activities in Boston. He was a merchant there. And then when he came to Detroit, he saw, and he was a millionaire, and he saw the need for the iron industry. And he he established the Michigan Central Railroad. James F. Joy, the gentleman sitting next to him, was pictured next to him. He was also involved in the Michigan Central Railroad. He became president at one time, but he was also instrumental in Chicago, Illinois. He was the president of the Burlingame Quincy Railroad. And what's so significant about James F. Joy was our former president, President Lincoln, was James F. Joy's law clerk before he became president. James F. Joy was an attorney, and he had a very lucrative law firm. And he hired President Lincoln as his law clerk. And President Lincoln litigated many cases that involved the railroad before he decided to run and become president. So James F. Joy and John Murray Forbes were very involved in the Underground Railroad movement, even before it was popular. But again, as I said, they had the money, they had the means, and they had the gall to defy the laws, to assist those who were seeking freedom. Eberbrock Ward and his uncle Samuel Ward, the Ward Foundry and Shipping Dock was in Wyandotte, Michigan. And many of the boats that the Wards built and captained, they would lend to the Michigan Central Railroad so that they could bring freedom seekers up and down the river. There was the Mayflower, the May Queen, and several other boats, which we'll show later, that were part of their fleet that they allowed the Michigan Central Railroad to use. And their stories of freedom seekers being hid on their boats as they were seeking freedom coming back from Canada. The Pelham gentlemen at the bottom, Robert, Fred, Benjamin, and Alfred, all have a connection to not only the Michigan Central Railroad, but Wayne County Community College District. Alfred Pelham was eventually a president, and his third grandfather, Robert Pelham, designed a patent, and he worked for the Michigan Central Railroad. He was hired by Zechariah Chandler, who was also on the board of 4th Street Presbyterian Church. He was involved in the Michigan Central Railroad. And so they had a relationship, and he hired him to work for the Michigan Central Railroad. So that was Robert Pelham. So as you can see, again, this is a view of what the Michigan Central Railroad Depot looked like on 3rd Street. The faded black and white image up in the upper left, that's facing 3rd Street. So if you're going down, if you're passing the 4th Street Presbyterian Church and Wayne County Community College District going towards 3rd Street, that's where the depot sat. Again, you see that roundhouse in the back, you see that dome document. The black and white picture actually shows you what the depot looks like in print. That picture was taken in the late 1860s. Below again, that's another image of the roundhouse in the Michigan Central Railroad yard, what it looked like in the early 1850s. And then again, there's an image below trimmed in red, where you see where the downtown campus sits and where the depot sit. There wasn't a train station, just the depot building itself, where it sat in relationship to where the college sits today. These are some of the ships that the Michigan Central Railroad used to help freedom seekers. There's a gentleman, his name is Nicholas Marsh. He's a historian. There's a book, it's called The Main Line, the Michigan Central Railroad. He wrote that book because all of his ancestors worked for the Michigan Central Railroad. And he provided a lot of these images to me as I shape this history. I have been working on these stories about 9 years now, researching the Underground Railroad movement in Detroit and how the Michigan Central Railroad was involved in that movement. And so these are some of the boats that were lent by the wards to the Michigan Central Railroad, and many of them transported freedom seekers back and forth across the Detroit River. During the time of the Underground Railroad movement, the Detroit River has been dug out. It was much closer to Canada as it is today. I'm told during Prohibition, there were car chases across the frozen river, but people could walk across. That's how close it was during that time. But over time, the erosion, the river has been dug out, and it's much further from each other, from the Canadian shore than it was back then. But these are some of the ships that travel back and forth carrying freedom seekers. So again, this is an article from the Detroit Free Press in 1859. It talks about when Frederick Douglass came to Detroit, again, with William Webb, again, meeting with John Brown to talk about Harper's Ferry and how they could help. And they helped him, and they did think he was a little eccentric. Some people called him crazy, some people, but he was adamant that he wanted to stop slavery. But he was a white man, and so he could do things that the Black men could not do. So they did support him with money, and they raised money for John Brown in support of Harper's Ferry. So in 1861, there were some pivotal things happening in the world during this time. President Lincoln had been sworn in, and the Civil War had just begun. But in the world of the Underground Railroad, there were some other things that were going on that just shocked people. Those of you who have been to Chicago know its beautiful skyline, but it also has a dark, dark past. Again, there's George de Baptiste with the black beard on one side, and that's his brother, Richard de Baptiste, on the other side. Richard de Baptiste lived in Chicago. He was a minister of the Zoar Baptist Church. And so they were brothers living in two different states, but they were both involved in the Underground Railroad movement. And as you can see in the middle, there's an ad that George de Baptiste put out talking about his steamer, the T. Whitney, and how it, of course, you couldn't outright say that it helped people escape to freedom. But those who were involved in the movement knew what this boat was, and they knew how they could get to Canada freedom through this boat. But the Chicago were having their own issues. On April 7th, 1861, well, April 6th, 1861, but it went on to the 7th, that the city of Chicago decided after it wasn't an insurrection, it was more of a confrontation of an African-American man in the city. The mayor and the governor decided that they were going to send all of the Black people back to slavery, South. And Richard and his brother, they were just appalled. Richard had to get word to his brother that this was happening. And so on April 7th, 1861, the Zoar Baptist Church took 300 of their parishioners, and they boarded the Michigan Southern Railroad, the Michigan Central Railroad, and many ferries, and they headed for Detroit. And this is an actual event. You can search it. It's called the Great Chicago Exodus. And it talks about people traveling from Illinois to Chicago, from Chicago, Illinois to Detroit for freedom. So the congregation boarded the trains. They said goodbye to the people that they knew, and they headed to Detroit because they did not want to go back to slavery. And these are just some of the articles that were published during that time, talking about the event. Some say 300, some say 100, some say, we don't know the exact number, but many of those people stayed in Detroit, but many of them escaped to Canada because they were seeking freedom, and they knew they may not be safe in Canada because the fugitive slave laws were enacted during that time. And so they many of them decided to move on. But it was just really interesting that the entire state decided that they no longer wanted the Black people in the state. So they decided they were going to ship them back to slavery. Adam Crosswhite. Of course, Adam Crosswhite is one of the most famous freedom seeker stories that is very well known. Him and his family were slaves. They were in Kentucky, and they ended up in Marshall, Michigan. And just like the Blackburn case, the slave catcher came to get his property. They wanted him and his family back. And of course, the town decided they were not going to have that. So he boarded the Michigan Central Railroad, came to Detroit. The case was heard in court in Detroit. Senator Zachariah Chandler, who was also very involved in the Underground Railroad movement, assisted in that case, as well as the previous gentleman, James F. Joy. He was on his defense team. He was an attorney. He was on his legal team. Senator Zachariah Chandler raised money for the Crosswhite case so that the other people who helped him could get off. So it was a very, very important case in the Underground Railroad movement as he traveled the Michigan Central Railroad. There are many documented cases of people who escaped the Underground Railroad and ending up in Detroit. Ohio has a project, it's called Documenting Ohio, and they tell different stories and freedom seekers, some of them all over Michigan, in Ohio, and Kentucky. And this is one story in particular. It was Richard Daley and his family. They ended up escaping at night. And their stop was the Michigan Central Railroad so that they could get to Canada. And of course, the story, he says it happened in between 1857 and 58. another story. Now, this story is interesting because Gould's, the Colored Tavern that they were saying that is near the Central Depot is right in downtown Detroit, more than likely where MBD Bank, or now it's Comerica Bank, sits downtown in Detroit. And he talks about his story and traveling, escaping from Ohio, from Kentucky to Ohio to Detroit. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, how important Kentucky and Ripley, Ohio was to the Underground Railroad movement story. If you've never been to Ripley, Ohio, it is a place to see. Many of the homes in Ripley, Ohio are the exact same as they were in the 1820s and 1830s. It's a very historic town. George Reynolds, he was there's no picture of him. We don't know what he looks like, but he worked for the Michigan Central Railroad and he was very involved in the Underground Railroad movement. And that picture that I'm pointing to with the red arrow, these are the Michigan Central Railroad lines, and you see how they stop at 3rd Street. That picture where it shows his home, that's where the roundhouse was. The pictures where I showed earlier, where it showed the dome document that was on the Underground Railroad, the Michigan Central Railroad yard, that's where his home was, right across from there. So that arrow points to where he lived. So he was, many of the Underground Railroad operatives who were Black did not want their picture taken because remember, this was illegal and they did not want to be seen. They did not want people to know who they were. And so some of them their pictures were never taken. They tried to guess about who he was and what he looked like in stories preceding his death, but no one really knew who he was or what he looked like, except that he was very involved in the Underground Railroad movement in Jackson. And he worked for the Michigan Central Railroad as well. This is a documented story. This is a documented story that was found in the newspaper. The Johnson's Hotel sat, if you've ever town and you know where Joe Louis Arena was, this is where the Johnson Hotel sat, right on the river. It was right across the street from the Michigan Central Railroad's depot. And this is a documented story that was published in the abolitionist newspaper. And he talked about being a slave. He talked about how he escaped. And he worked for the hotel. And so as you can see, he said he was serving coffee and he looked up and he was serving coffee to the man who had been looking for him. But because the slave catcher did not know what he looked like, he did not know who he was. And so fortunately, after he served that gentleman coffee, he escaped across to Canada because he knew that someone was there looking for him. So this is an actual documented story that's published. This gentleman, Alan Pinkerton, he was a detective. And if some of you who may be a little bit older than me, but I know my grandparents talked about the television show, The Wild Wild West. Well, the Wild Wild West television show was actually patterned after the Pinkerton Detective Agency. All the horse chases and where they were chasing the trains, and it was patterned after Alan Pinkerton. Alan Pinkerton was an abolitionist. He had a relationship with James F. Joy, of course, who was the owner of the Chicago, Burlingame, and Quincy Railroad. He transported John Brown through the Michigan Central Railroad and paid for him to travel along those routes. And so he was very involved in the Underground Railroad movement out of Chicago. I talked a little bit about Ohio. I talked a little bit about Ohio And I just wanted to just share a little bit of that story. Harriet Beecher Stowe's relatives lived in Detroit. They were merchants. And so she had relatives all over the Midwest who were involved in the Underground Railroad movement and were abolitionists. The story of Eliza and Uncle Tom's Cabin is where she crossed in Ripley, Ohio. The home up on the upper right, that's the home of John Parker. John Parker was a Black abolitionist. That house is standing today just as you see it. He educated all of his children. They all went to college, but his home sits on the river. And according to Harriet Beecher Stowe's story, when Eliza crossed the Kentucky River into Ohio, the home of John Parker is the home that she ended up at. But he knew she was not safe. We don't have a picture of John Parker. We do not know what he looks like. He got him, Liza and her family, her child, to the home of John and Jean Rankin. John and Jean Rankin's home is a mile above, up on a hill above John Parker's home. I've been to both of these homes, and it's very fascinating to see. The Ohio Historical Society are refurbishing the staircase that goes from the tip of John Parker's house to the back door of John Rankin's house. When you tour his home, there's a shotgun that sat over the back door. This is the front of the home. And his wife and children knew that if anyone came to the back door, they were to shoot them because they were protecting those freedom seekers who came from John Parker's home to their home. And they made sure that they either got across the river to Canada or they came to Michigan seeking freedom. He went to jail. He was caught helping. And while he was in jail, he told the jailers, when you get me out, I'm going to do it again because I believe in this movement and we should not be holding people as slaves. So their entire family was very involved in the Underground Railroad movement. And these homes are in Ripley, as I indicated earlier. They are exactly as you see them. It's a national park site now, as well as many of the homes that are in Ripley, Ohio. It's probably an hour from downtown Cincinnati, Ohio. If you haven't been to downtown Cincinnati, Ohio, there is a cabin, that sits on the second floor of the museum. It's a slave pen. That slave pen was acquired in 2003. Can you believe that? 2003. The curator of the museum was contacted by a German gentleman, and said that he thinks he has a slave pen in his backyard that was encased in a barn. The curator, John Witherspoon, went over to Kentucky and he visited the site. He wanted to feel what the slaves felt. And so he stayed in that barn for 3 months. He slept in it. He contacted authorities. It took them about 3 months to authenticate the barn to make sure it was what it said it was. He was contacted by the Klan. They told him if he didn't move it, they were going to burn it down. And so what he did was they took it apart and they hid it in a truck stop in Ohio and in Kentucky until they can reassemble it. And it sits today on the second floor of the International Freedom Museum in downtown Cincinnati, Ohio. That's the cabin where freedom seekers would stay sometime a week, sometime 3 months before they were sold down the river. And I'm sure you've heard that term. Before they were sold down the river to Natchez, Mississippi. So that's something else you can Google. as I'm researching and have been researching the Underground Railroad movement, I don't ever want to forget about the women who were pivotal and involved in that movement, helping freedom seekers to freedom. People like Mary Ann Shadd, who was an abolitionist, and she worked for freedom seekers on the eastern seaboard. Then there was Mary Ellen Harper, who was also involved in that movement. She was a lecturer during that time. And I'm sure many of you have heard about Laura Haviland. She was what many people said, she was very active. And sometimes you would not, she would carry a gun everywhere she went. But she was a Quaker and she was very involved in that movement as well. Julia Ward Howe was also an abolitionist. And she was the essayist on the Battle Hymn of Republic song, which was sung over John Brown's body when he died. Other women in that movement, Elizabeth Dickinson, who was a lecturer, and she was a candidate for the anti-slavery Republican candidacy. She campaigned for them. Mary Grew, who was also an abolitionist and a leader of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. And then there's Charlotte Lottie, who was also involved in that movement as an activist and a writer. And so we don't want to forget, even though the men were out front, we don't want to forget about our women who were also involved in this movement. They were behind the scenes, but they were just as active, that's just as diligent, and just as committed to understanding this history, making sure that they assisted these freedom seekers, and because it was a cause that they believed in. If you've been to downtown Detroit and you've seen these statues, this is Mr. Ed Dwight. There's a PBS special about him. Ed Dwight was the first Black astronaut candidate under the late President Kennedy. And when Kennedy was assassinated, he left the space program and became a sculptress. Could you imagine that? You start as a pilot and then you go and become a sculptress. The upper left-hand statue, that's the statue that sits on the Detroit River. And below it, the white obelisk, that statue sits in Canada. They are both, they sit at an exact point where they're facing each other, because that site down in Hart Plaza in downtown Detroit was a site of freedom. And the gentleman pointing is said to be George the Baptiste. And these are sculptures of freedom seekers. And then as you look at the sculpture, there are images of signs that were on quilts. And there's a lantern in the middle as well. So one is the Tower of Freedom, and one is the is also a freedom sculpture. There's one of Rosa Parks. That's in Michigan.
Okay, I have a couple things in the chat. Hold on a sec. First one, Dr. Carter, is people should be aware of the contemporary Rainbow Railroad, an anomalous operation helping LGBTQ and people escape countries such as Uganda, where the murder of the gay people is legal and common. And second is, how was the Cross-White case settled? Did it challenge the Fugitive Slave Act? I think we just lost her. Did we just lose Dr. Carter, Randall?
I think I think we did. I'm not quite sure what happened. Hmm.
Do you have her cell number?
Yes, let me.
Oh, there she
let me-
is. There she is.
I have no idea what happened.
There
Oh,
she
okay.
is. Hi. Phew.
I have no idea what happened. I'm sorry. I have no idea what happened.
Okay, there
I'm
you are.
glad you're
Did you-
back.
I'm back. I'm back. So that is pretty much the end of the presentation. I have one more slide just telling you guys how pivotal the Underground Railroad movement was in Detroit and how that movement helped shape there are a lot of historical cases that surrounded the Underground Railroad movement in Detroit. When I talked about the Crosswhite case, that was a case that's very important to Detroit's history because Thornton and Lucy Blackburn escaped the Kentucky plantation. They came to Detroit, and someone from the plantation came to Detroit and found them and saw them. And he went back and told, and then they came to Detroit looking for him. But by then, the Detroit residents were not having it. A riot ensued. If you've been to downtown Detroit and you know where the Skillman Library is, that was the site of the old jail. A riot ensued. The sheriff got shot. They placed Lucy in jail, and a woman from Second Baptist Church came into the jail and changed clothes with her, and she escaped across the river. They chased Thornton Blackburn to the river's edge. He made it across to Canada with the help of many abolitionists, but they were still leery. So when they got to Windsor, they moved further inward, and he ended up in Toronto, Canada. Thornton Blackburn started the first Black taxi cab company in Toronto, Canada. And he started in Detroit. So there are many, many stories about freedom seekers who ended up in Canada and to safety, who were in Detroit, who were in Michigan, who started in different places like Holland and Battle Creek and Flint and Ypsilanti. And because freedom seekers came from all over. They couldn't read and write. There was no telephone or internet, but somehow they knew how to find the people who were assisting them in this great movement. Thank you very, very much for listening today. And I am open for questions.
Reread the first couple that we had. Go back.
Okay.
One was, how was the Crosswhite case settled? Did it challenge the Fugitive Slave Act?
The Crosswhite case was settled. He did get off. He did get to Canada. I think it had some significance to the Fugitive Slave Act because as those laws were being shaped and enacted, they knew that they could not keep people from seeking freedom. So they had to continue to develop more laws. Then that evolved into the slave codes and to the peonage laws. If you're familiar with the peonage laws that were on the books until the 60s, peonage cases where people were enslaved and who freedom seekers were enslaved because they looked at a white person or they walked on the wrong side of the street or there was debt to the slave owner. And so it was, he did escape. They could not try him. He had good lawyers. And because James F. Joy and his team were experienced billionaires, and they were used to trying cases like that because there were many cases against the railroad during that time, not for slave cases, but accident cases. And so they were experienced attorneys. And so they were able to advocate for him, and Black people and white people and the Quakers raised money so that he could get off.
Amazing. The next question is, do you know how many freedom seekers remained in Detroit instead of escaping to Canada?
We don't know the exact number. Many of them stayed, many of them went to different places. A lot of them stayed and died in Detroit. Many of them are buried in Elmwood Cemetery right in Detroit. So many of them stayed, some of them left, went to Massachusetts, some of them went to Boston. You know, they were on a mission, and a lot of them wanted to see this movement continue and wanted to free as many freedom seekers as possible. And so they moved around a lot, because remember, they were also being chased. They were being pursued because people didn't like what they were doing, because this was a secret movement. So they did move around a lot, but a lot of them stayed in Detroit.
Then comment that there were a number of Underground Railroad safe sites in Mid and West Michigan, Marshall, Niles, and others.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter. This was a wonderful presentation. Are you continuing research on this part of U.S. history?
I am. As a genealogist and researcher, I love history, and I love learning more about history. So I can never get enough of it. I think Michigan is an untold story. People, when they think about the Underground Railroad, they think about Philadelphia, they think about Massachusetts, they think about Boston, but they don't think about Jackson, Michigan, and Ypsilanti, Michigan, and Ann Arbor, Michigan, and all those places where freedom seekers came because of that river, because they knew if they got to Michigan, they could get across to Canada. So my search continues. Like I said, I've been doing this research for over 10 years, and it started from a genealogical perspective. My great-grandmother was 110 when she died in 93, and she was the youngest of 21. And I was on a quest to learn her story. As I told Dr. Miller and Susan during the pandemic, my mother died from COVID, and I wanted to get out of the house. And so I have established a connection with my slave-owning descendants, and I have visited them. So that's been a wonderful experience. And all history is public history, and we all share a great history. My Irish ancestors are Kirby's. They were signed the Covenant contract. My great grandfather, my 4 times grandfather on my father's side was a Halliburton. He served on the Confederate side, so he was considered a traitor because he went to the war as a slave of his slave master's son. And so he could not get a pension from the United States because he was considered a traitor. It took him 80 years to get $85 a month. So, you know, all of our history is intertwined. You know, I'm Irish, I'm German, I'm Jewish, I'm African-American, I'm Native American, and I celebrate it all.
Another comment is, I'm glad you mentioned that the quilt block story is a myth. Extensive research was done by well-known quilt historians, and the woman who wrote the book, Hidden in Plain View, was the only one that promoted that story. There was no other references to quilts in the slave narrative or other histories.
Absolutely. And that's why you have to look at those dates. Just like I'm gonna put my genealogy hat on for a minute. When you're researching your ancestors and researching people, you're learning about history, and you're putting yourself and your lives in the context of history. And so you have to look at those dates and find out what was happening during that time. What was happening during 1850? What was happening during the Spanish War? What was happening during the flu pandemic? And how does my life and my history fit into that? And I often tell my genealogy students, when you're writing your history and you're telling your story, put your life in the context of history, because you may not have pictures, you may not have specific events, but if you can talk about what was going on in the world during that time, you can shape your story. And many of us have freedom seekers that are involved, that were involved in that movement in our history that we may not even know of, because our ancestors did not always pass down those stories. In my specific genealogy, our ancestors passed down the pain. They didn't always pass down the good stories. And so I tell my students, learn those history and know that, understand that all history is public history. And those stories are false until you learn the truth, because you were not there.
Okay. The last comment I have in the chat is just from a member who wants to make sure people are aware there's a contemporary Rainbow Railroad, an analogous operation helping LGBTQ people escape countries such as Uganda, where the murder of gay people is legal and common.
So are you asking me, do I know about it, or are they just providing information?
Yeah, just providing information.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know. I'm glad to hear that. I think that, you know, that it's a movement. It's not a physical entity. It's a movement. And we want to make sure that people participate in that, and people are passionate about that, helping people escape whatever atrocities that they are involved in around the world. But you'd be surprised at the number of people outside of the United States and outside of Detroit have never heard of the Underground Railroad movement. They don't know what it is, and they think it's an actual train.
Right. Right. That's the last comment in the chat here is from Ann that says it's very concerning and very sad that there are public officials who want to keep information like this from school children, which is exactly what we were talking about before class started, how much of this is left out of history.
Yeah, it's not a myth. This stuff actually happened. And, you know, and like I say, it's not a white and a black thing, it's an American thing. And we have to all understand the role that our ancestors played in it. Some of you on this call, you may have ancestors that were deeply involved in that movement, and you may not know. And you know, I encourage you to find those stories and listen to oral history. There's a little bit of truth in our oral history, but our job is to find the truth in those stories and share those with our children and our family and the people around us, so that I think as we continue to do that and continue to tell those stories and seek the truth, we will be a better society for it.
Great. Thank you so much. That's all I have. So if anyone else would like to unmute themselves to ask a comment or question, go ahead. Otherwise, Randall might have one.
It looked like John Buttrey, did you have a question? No, okay. Well, Dr. Carter, before we close out, just one question. It's heartwarming to hear your story of going back to the plantation where your ancestors lived. Do you have any sense through the various organizations in Detroit and your own personal interactions, if there are groups that are meeting to share more of this information because of their own ancestry? What can you tell us about that?
There are some. I would encourage you to get involved in your local genealogical society. Right now, a lot of them are doing it virtual. The Oakland County Genealogical Society is very big. If you're not familiar with them, actually, I traveled to Salt Lake City with them 3 times to do genealogical research. They have been going to Salt Lake City to the Family History Library since the 80s. And so they do a lot of speakers. If you are a member of the Mormon Church or know someone who's a member of the Mormon Church, if you go to familyhistorylibrary.org, that's a lot of the records on ancestry and family history are similar. Family History Library is run by the Mormon Church. They have a lot of records. They have a library in Salt Lake City that's 5 floors, and each country has a floor. So if you ever get the opportunity to go, its sister facility is in Fort Wayne, Indiana. It's called the Allen County Public Library. And you can go there and do genealogical research. Or if you go to the familyhistory.org website and there's a record that you want, you can order it through the library, through their website, and have it sent to a Mormon church where you can review the record. If it's microfiche, you might want to check with the church to see if they have a microfiche reader. If you have a family book or a history book that you want to preserve, you can send it to the Family History Library, and they will put it in their archives for free. They will bind it and put it in the stacks, and it will be there forever. They have billions of records. They have a vault in the mountain. So I've researched with them. So I would just check with your local genealogical societies to see when they meet.
Okay, great. Fran, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, is there a book that pulls some of these different aspects of the Underground Railroad, through various states together?
There are some. There's a book called Fluid Frontier, It's written by Dr. Carolyn Frost and Dr. Roy Finkenbein. They talk about some of that history. Eric Fortner did a book about the Underground Railroad. Carol Mall did a book about the Underground Railroad in Michigan. So there are some, just bits and pieces, but there's not one central piece. And I am putting together a publication for all the research that I've done, specifically because I did my research on the people who were not Black. Because for me, some of the Black people are obvious, but I wanted to tell those stories and learn about those histories of those people who were not as obvious. And it opened up a door for me and allowed me to learn about these people that you would never know that, people have heard about Lewis Cass. Lewis Cass, of course, was a slave owner. And him and William Macomb from Macomb County William Macomb was the largest slave owner in Michigan. And they traded, Lewis Cass bought slaves from him. That's documented. There is stories about that. So if you search William Macomb, you will see that you will learn that he was a very large slave owner in Michigan. So there are some.
Any other questions before we close out? John, you have one now. Okay.
I went to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. I don't know how close that is to Ripley, but I think I heard there was some, Underground Railroad stop there. Have you heard anything about Oxford, Ohio?
I have heard about Oxford, Ohio, because a lot of freedom seekers came from different states and ended, because Ohio was a free state. They ended up in little towns like Oxford and just all the little towns along the river, because there are 7 bridges that connect Kentucky and Ohio right now. But think about all the waterways that people who escaped Kentucky, and ended up in different states in Ohio. So I have heard about those, but a lot of them, they were on a task. They were on a mission to get to Canada. So they traveled through those little towns in Ohio to get to Canada, to get the freedom.
Yeah, because Oxford is about 25 miles north of Cincinnati.
Yes, I've heard of Oxford, absolutely. Yeah. There's if you go to the Ohio Memory website, it's called Ohio Memory. It's a website, and they have stories and stories of handwritten notes and things that were involved in the Underground Railroad. So if you research that on the web, you can pull down some of those stories.
Good, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Well, Dr. Carter, your passion for history and for ancestry, and clearly the 9 years of research that you've put into the Underground Railroad was most evident in your presentation. So we are extremely appreciative of sharing this information. I think you had a very engaged audience this morning. So
well,
thank you. Thank you. Let's give her a hand. Yes,
thank
indeed.
you. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I think some people have their hand raised. I see some hand. Oh, maybe they're just clapping. Okay, because I want to make sure. And let me give you my email address in case you guys want to email me. It can be an Underground Railroad question. It can be a genealogy question. My email is the word ancestors with an S. And then my initial CC at Gmail. So it's ancestors with an S, the letter C and C at gmail.com. Feel free to email me if you have some questions or something you want to know, or a book that you want. I can send you some resources where you can read some more information about the Underground Railroad. And just a little tidbit, Wayne County Community College District just received their local Underground Railroad historic designation last week.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, so they will be getting, and now they're going to be probably going for a national designation as well. So, yep.
Well, that's big news, and it's great to have you today. Wonderful to see you, and keep up the good work and your most interesting research.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, everyone, and have a blessed day.
Thank you.
Everybody.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Carter. This was just really important and really, really excellent.
Oh, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. You're very welcome. I'm glad that you were able to participate. And thank you all for taking the time to participate today. And email me if you have any questions.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.